We are keeping our eyes at the White House for the arrival of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a short while from now. Some European leaders, or all of them, have arrived at the White House. We are also expecting some leaders to make their way at the Oval, where we expect the President of the United States, Donald Trump, to host these leaders and to also speak with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Susan Teherani is our correspondent. She's live in New York. Susan Teherani, what are some of the expectations? I know I asked this before, but what are some of the expectations that Americans are having on this meeting?
Yeah, Americans want to see an end to this war, just like everyone else at this point around the world. You have to look at it from also an economic standpoint, an economic perspective as well. When President Trump was campaigning, one of his campaign promises, and one that appealed to a lot of voters, was to scale back support for Ukraine and focus on the United States. And you saw that sentiment echoed in his interview with Fox News' Sean Hannity immediately after the meeting with Vladimir Putin. He said that I want to get this over with so I can focus on America. That's music to the ears of Americans. Of course, there are those who believe that peace at any price is not viable. There are those that believe that Ukraine's security is tied to Europe's security, and Europe's security is tied to the United States' security. So there are different viewpoints on how this war should end, but there's no doubt that everyone agrees that it's high time for the killing and the bloodshed to end. Volodymyr Zelensky right now faces a very tough task ahead of him. He's possibly going to be presented with options that aren't the best and viable for him. Not only the message that President Trump is relaying from Russia, but also the Europeans as well. I think the trick will be to see, and it'll go back to how Americans feel, and I think Americans also want to see this. It'll be to see what kind of security guarantees Ukraine is going to get, not only from its allies in the West, but to an extent from Russia as well.
Susan Teherani, stay with me. This is German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who's just arrived at the White House. He's the sixth leader from Europe to arrive at the White House ahead of this meeting between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. And Volodymyr Zelensky has just tweeted. I'll just read part of the tweet for you. He says, "Our main goal is a reliable and lasting peace for Ukraine and for the whole of Europe. And it is important that the momentum of all our meetings lead to precisely this result. We understand that we shouldn't expect Putin to voluntarily abandon aggression and new attempts at conquest. That is why pressure must work, and it must be joint pressure from the United States and Europe and from everyone in the world who respects the right to life and the international order." Mr. Fred Weir, what do you make of Zelensky's statement ahead of this summit or meeting?
Well, he's still hopeful that he can swing Trump onto his side and get, I guess, back to the situation as it was under Biden, where the West presented a united front in support of Ukraine. Because, of course, Trump has discombobulated everybody by breaking ranks and taking a different view on the way forward to peace. I'd like to just point out that, I guess it's the elephant in the room here, but the Russian forces are moving forward at an increasingly rapid clip. They have overcome most of the fortified belts in the Donbass. There's just a small area, about 20% of Donetsk left, an agglomeration of very heavily fortified pair of cities, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. But even Pokrovsk, another one, is, as we speak, encircled by Russian forces and heavily penetrated by them. There isn't, if Putin doesn't get what he wants at the bargaining table, he has a plan B, which is to continue fighting until he forces Ukraine's capitulation. I think he must have impressed that upon Trump in their meeting the other day, and that makes it sort of urgent for Ukraine to, accept Putin's terms, because if, as harsh as they sound and as unacceptable as they sound to him, 6 months from now they're going to be much worse. And if European leaders or everyone else has some idea of how to reverse the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine, to start driving back the Russians, to make Putin feel like he could get defeated, well, then let them show how that could be. But after 3.5 years of a full united West, throwing everything in to help Ukraine, and here we are, Ukraine is sort of on the verge of defeat. I think it's time to make peace, and I'm so sorry to say, probably mostly on Putin's terms.
Fred Weir, stay with me. Susan Tehrani, the President of the United States did post something on True Social, which for most people is interesting. I'll just read the statement that he posted ahead of this meeting. A big day at the White House. We have never had so many European leaders here at one time. A great honor for America. Let's see what the result will be. Signed, President DJT. What are Americans saying about his post?
Yeah, I don't know how much we can focus on the American public when it comes to this dynamic. We could to a certain extent, but there are a lot of people who are disengaged and war-weary from what's happening, notably when it comes to Europe. Again, there are those that ideologically support Ukraine. There are those that want to see the United States not even be involved in any kind of way. There are those that support, of course, President Trump and his peace through strength policies. But you know, this is not hovering over the American public's head in a way that other issues perhaps are these days. So while Americans are looking at this, just like anyone else around the world, those who have been invested in it are looking at this and wondering, as our guest rightly noted, whether or not Ukraine will ultimately have to swallow this bitter pill, and whether or not a realistic approach needs to be taken to end this war in one way or the other. The one thing that I think most Americans are united on is this war needs to end. Now, on what terms? Again, that's the million-dollar question. But nonetheless, I think they're going to be, also looking at it through the lens of how President Trump is dealing with all of this. Like I mentioned, he does mention that this is Biden's war. It's not his war. That's true. It wasn't under his presidency. But now how it ends and what happens moving forward is going to be one of his foreign policy legacies that will define his second administration and his second term for sure.
Susan Tehrani is our correspondent in New York. We are still keeping our eyes on what is happening at the White House, and several leaders, including UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, EU President Ursula von der Leyen, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte have already arrived, and they've been received by Monica Crawley, who's the Chief of Protocol, who's receiving the European delegation at the White House. And there's so much talk about what Volodymyr Zelensky, the man of the moment, will be wearing. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will once again forego a traditional suit when he meets US President Donald Trump at the White House, instead opting for a military-style outfit. Zelensky, who has worn army tones, sweatshirts, polos and military-style outfits in public appearances since the Kremlin's full-scale invasion 3 years ago, has previously been criticized by some MAGA Republicans for not dressing up to meet the US President. So we will be waiting with bated breath to see what Zelensky will be wearing at the White House any moment from now. Susan, a lot of anticipation is growing ahead of this meeting.
A lot. This is a remarkable moment. On the one hand, you can look at the positive side of what has become of Europe and NATO alliance. The West seems more united than ever. There are European leaders, as you mentioned, not just the Finnish leader, but also someone like Giorgia Meloni, or even NATO chief Mike Rutte, who have...
Susan, sorry to cut you short, but this is the arrival of French President Emmanuel Macron, who has just arrived at the White House. He's the seventh leader, or the seventh European leader, to arrive at the White House ahead of this summit, or ahead of this meeting between President Trump, President Volodymyr Zelensky, and the European leaders. Susan, continue.
Yeah, I was just saying that it's really, if you want to look on the bright side, it's a moment of strength for Europe, Western alliance, for the way that NATO allies are gathering, and they're, NATO is very strong right now, stronger than possibly it's ever been. When you think about it, and you have some European leaders, some more than others, that have a very favorable relationship with the U.S. president. You talked about the message that the Finnish leader put out prior to this meeting and visiting Washington, D.C. Giorgia Meloni of Italy also struck an optimistic note on her social media post, saying that she hopes that there is a viable and peaceful solution with the mediation of Donald Trump to kind of reach some sort of understanding. But again, the devil's in the details, as we always say. It's going to be up to Ukraine. They say that it's up to Ukraine to determine whether or not it wants to ultimately give up some kind of land, of how these concessions are going to look like. But there's no doubt that the West seems united. This is an important meeting. It shows strength. But on the other hand, it's also a very detrimental one. When you read between the lines, you see that it could go in any number of ways. There is a possibility that nothing happens during this meeting. The European leaders came all the way to Washington. Zelensky and Trump have another meeting. It's right after the heels of that Alaska meeting. And Ukraine just doesn't agree to even minor terms that have been put forth by Russia. And then what? What happens? Will the United States impose more sanctions against Russia and third countries that are doing business with Russia? Will it go all out? Will it stop sending weapons? Will it do it through Europe and not directly? It could go any number of ways, but I think our guest also mentioned it so accurately that, 3.5 years in, this is where we are right now. There was an opportunity maybe a year and a half ago that some kind of peace settlement could have been reached. It was back then, it was UK's Boris Johnson that apparently warned Zelensky not to do that. Or is that going to happen once again here, and we're just going to, 6 months down the line, again, everyone's going to gather? Or is this the moment of truth? Is this the time where ultimately, something's going to give? And I think a lot of that hinges on what kind of security guarantees not only can Europe and the West, the United States, can present for Ukraine, what they're willing to do. A lot of it is going to rest on how much of that Russia is going to agree to.
Yeah.